legislation. So it's been around well over 20 years. Well, actually more. It probably supersedes the FTC 1979 franchise rule. Many states formed the registration process before the FTC did. So franchise associations and franchise law have been in place for many years. But why you're seeing it now? Because I believe more and more franchisees are being adversely affected by the current legal strategy of franchisor attorneys that give franchisors godlike rights and treat franchisees as sometimes second-class citizens. So franchisees are the ones that put up the capital, invest the time, and they are in fact stakeholders in the brand. And that will probably not resonate with franchisor attorneys who believe that the franchisor is the stakeholder and the franchisor is the dictator of the brand. So I think you see a lot of that. And some of it's self-interest of individual, for instance, the guy that introduced the bill in Pennsylvania was a Quiznos franchisee that lost his house. So that was a personal thing that he introduced that legislation. In New Hampshire, the gentleman that introduced the legislation saw what we were doing in Maine and saw it as an opportunity, he's an attorney, to possibly get some business from franchisees. So sometimes it's not necessarily a planned strategy, it just happens because of the number of complaints that franchisee attorneys are hearing from franchisees.
What is your general's thoughts on franchisees being a stakeholder?
So I'll offer some thoughts on that. I don't think that there are, well, I should say in my experience, I've gotten a really great opportunity to work with a number of franchise systems. If there are any more out there, always looking for new ones to work with. But certainly with the clients that I work with, I don't think you would find a single one of them that would suggest that franchisees don't have a stake in the system. I have never experienced that. I won't go so far as to say it doesn't exist, because I'm a firm believer that there are a lot of things that exist that I don't know about. But it certainly has not been my personal experience. Nor have I seen, by the way, some sudden uptick in litigation claims brought by franchisors against franchisees that might justify what I would consider a very broad brush approach that this legislation that we've seen proposed really amounts to. I'll tell you that one of my frustrations and concerns with addressing concerns to the extent that they exist by legislation is it is a very broad brush that one has to paint. It is the very nature of legislation. We enact it and it applies to everyone, regardless of the factual situation for particular people. I mean, I thought the best articulation of this concept was what Governor Brown just said out in California this week or late last week. I've lost track now of my days, but this week. Okay, we're at Wednesday already, right? So, when he vetoed legislation out there and said, you know, he said, I just don't see the actual problem here. And I share his view. I don't see it either. And when you take this incredibly broad approach to dealing with what I am sure there are problems out there. I have no doubt that there are individual issues that, you know, have bad results at times. Legislation is not the way to deal with it because it just affects so many more people and has such consequences throughout really the whole business of franchising that I think it's a mistake. And I will tell you personally, I don't know why they're all being introduced now, except for, at best, coincidence of events that are tied together by some individual concerns or opportunities, I think, by people who look at it.
Can I quote Governor Brown? I am open to reforming the California Franchise Relationship Act to give more protections to franchisees if there are indeed unacceptable or predatory practices by franchisors. So,
But I think that makes the point. It's a solution in search of a problem. And I think, I don't know the answer either as to why now, but I can speak to some of the states, Maine included, where it was actually wealthy franchisees who are sometimes 10 or 20 times larger than the franchisors that are the small ones that make up the majority of franchisors. It's not Dunkin' Donuts, it's small franchisors. Those franchisees are very well funded and dwarf the size of the franchisors they're seeking to legislate. And that's why I call it a solution in search of a problem. There aren't specific things in the broad brush of these state, proposed state legislation that haven't been successful are all encompassing for every problem. There might even possibly exist, some of which don't exist yet. And I think that's why you're seeing pushback from the legislatures saying, as Governor Brown vetoed it, what is the real problem? Show us the statistics, show us the data that shows there's a real problem, and what impact are you going to have? I hope that doesn't get lost in the conversation tonight about the small franchisors, less than 100, less than 50, which make up the majority of systems. They're going to be crushed by this. Dunkin' Donuts can deal with it. I suppose in some way they won't like it, but they can probably deal with it. How do you deal with a small franchisor? And I think that's one of the reasons why you're seeing so much pushback. But as far as the why, I think my personal perspective is it's wealthy franchisees in big systems trying to fight with the big systems, and they have their own kind of category, which is very small.
Well, 2 days ago when Governor Brown vetoed the proposed California franchise relationship law, in his letter he called for a collaboration between the opposing parties. What is the chance of there being a collaboration between both franchisor and franchisee representatives in this issue?
Well, if I can speak, one of the reasons that it may be coming to a state level more than it has previously, there was a federal bill that was pending about 15, 20 years ago. I haven't heard any talk of that in over 10 years, so I think the fact of a federal bill to protect franchisees has gone to the wayside. So now the states realize, wait a minute, someone needs to come to the plate to protect the franchisees who there are problems. I mean, I represent franchisees, and I've seen, that there are millions of people in this country who have invested their life savings into a business trusting a franchisor to act in good faith. And in contract law, you imply good faith. But in franchise law, you can disavow any good faith. You can specify, we can take everything from you, everything is at risk. Franchisees, most of them do not hire competent counsel. They do not get a lawyer to look at the agreement, to explain it to them. They buy a business concept. They buy that juicy, yummy sandwich that franchise system's selling. They're buying the point of sale system looks great, the image looks great. They're not looking at that provision that says, all right, on a whim, we can take back your business and pay you book value or fair market value, whichever is lower. All kinds of provisions that affects the equity in their business and totally can take away an entire family's life savings, and I've seen it over and over and over again. There is that problem, and there is a basic level of fairness that this legislation is seeking to place into the contracts. And big, small, in the franchise system, there are certain provisions that are in almost every agreement. But do I think there can be a collaboration? I think no matter what, the IFA, although I could be convinced differently, will always oppose any law to protect franchisees because somehow it will be misread or misapplied. That regardless, if you put in, for instance, in 90% of the franchise agreements, it says, at least, these are the grounds for termination. It has to be for good cause, and then there's an opportunity to cure. In most situations, here are some situations where there's no 30-day right to cure. There may be a 24-hour right to cure. Now, these type of things, legislation, you could say, yes, and before you can take away that person's life savings, that person's equity in this business, there needs to be certain thresholds, for instance, determination, renewal, and not completely changing the market condition on that person who invested their life savings in the business. So I think, I think there is a need, and that's why we're seeing this legislation pop up now.
See, I actually think this is part of the challenge, right here, is what we heard, is that, first of all, not every franchisee invests his or her life savings into a franchise. I just, are there some? Absolutely. There are people who do it. But to suggest that every franchisee has invested his or her life savings into this particular investment, I don't think that's a true and accurate statement. And so we're now taking this subset of people in the franchise community, and we're extrapolating out to everyone. I mean, that's the problem, again, with the legislation. It just applies to everyone. And I think, Suzanne, what your question was is, can the sides ever collaborate? I think they can, but I also think that the franchisor side gets knocked pretty hard. Says they're never, IFA is never going to collaborate. They're never going to talk to anybody. They're just going to stick their sword in the sand or their stick in the sand, and that's it. And I don't think that's accurate to start with. But I will tell you that from my perspective, and I don't speak for the IFA. I speak for me. I probably don't speak for Nixon Peabody either, so I should say that too. Fire me on the spot or something. But it's certainly hard to have a trust-building relationship when we look at some of these bills. I mean, they're just so beyond the pale. It's not what I would want to see as someone with whom I think I can build a real trustworthy and working relationship. And it starts.
Are you referring to the bill? Or
Yes, I'm referring to the bill.
But what would you like to see that would make sense for everybody?
I'm sorry.
What would you like to see that would make sense for both parties?
I think it depends. I mean, I actually don't think that there needs to be legislation. But I'm the first person to admit that I could be wrong. I've certainly been wrong on a lot of other things, and I'm sure I'll be wrong on a lot more in the future, and my wife and daughters will constantly tell me about that. But, if I haven't seen yet the proposed bill that I think is really necessary. Does that mean that I'm not willing to look at any bill? No, I'm willing to look at any bill, and I think there are people who are a lot smarter in this world than I am. And they might propose something, and I'd say, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. For example, I like the FTC rule. I don't want to do away with FDDs, or if you're even a little bit older, UFOCs. I think that they play an important role. I might like to change a little bit to make it, I think, a little bit more user-friendly, but that's not what we're talking about tonight. It's a whole other thing, but I like that. I'm not going to support any effort to get rid of it. I mean, franchisors could do that, but we don't need disclosure. Let everybody figure it out on their own. It's silly. I mean, it's just silly. So, when you look at the bills, it's very easy to talk in sound bites. I'm not very good at it, quite frankly. So I have to revert back to the more humble means of actually sitting down and reading the bill. And I've done that. I've read the proposed bill in Massachusetts. I've read the proposed bill in New Hampshire. I've read the proposed bills in Maine. They're not a place to start from really building trust. So I'd like to think that the sides could collaborate, but boy, it's awfully hard to do it when you start at this extreme.
Could you, or one of you, please chime in, give an overview of what is in these bills? A lot of these people have never read the bills and don't have a clue what we're talking about.
Well, one thing that, I did put